Eggs Benedict, Marco said, gesturing to a beautifully plated dish. I've used Pruto instead of Canadian bacon and added a touch of truffle to the Holland. Days Mr. Davenport sampled a few bites, his expression unreadable after a moment. He nodded. Impressive, Marco, your creativity never fails to surprise me. Remember, only start plating after the guests arrive. We want everything to be fresh and at the perfect temperature. As they exited the kitchen, Mr. Davenport turned to Elena. Thank you. Everything seems to be in order. He paused, studying her face. You're new here, aren't you? I don't recall seeing you before. Elena nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. Yes, sir. This is my 3rd week. I started 2 weeks ago. Mr. Davenport's eyes traveled from her face to her impeccably pressed uniform. You've presented yourself very well. Keep up the good work, and you'll surely be rewarded. Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Thank you, sir. I'm honored to work here. Just then Mrs. Davenport appeared, looking stunning in an elegant silk dress. Elena couldn't help but marvel at her beauty, feeling a twinge of envy at the seemingly perfect life she led. Mr. Davenport's demeanor changed instantly. His eyes lit up as he saw his wife, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. You look beautiful, darling, he said, kissing her cheek. You'll make quite an impression on our guests. But as Elena watched, she noticed something off about Mrs. Davenport's reaction. There was a slight flinch when her husband touched her attention in her shoulders that didn't match the affectionate gesture. Elena dismissed it, assuming it was residual awkwardness from their earlier argument. If there's nothing else, I'll return to my duties, Elena said, preparing to excuse herself. Mr. Davenport nodded, his attention still on his wife. He kissed her cheek again, inhaling her perfume. You smell divine, he murmured. Mrs. Davenport remained silent, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Elena thought it was sweet in a way that even wealthy couples could have their moments of couple tension. She was sure things would smooth over as the day progressed. As Elena walked away, she glanced at her watch. It was 10 a.m. The guests would be arriving any moment. She overheard Mrs. Davenport speaking to her husband. I'll wait in the foyer and welcome the guests myself, she said, slipping free from Mr. Davenport's arm as she moved toward the grand front door. Mr. Davenport's reaction was immediate and startling. Sophia, he called out, his voice deep, firm, and serious. The sound froze Elena in her tracks, and she couldn't help but turn to look. Mr. Davenport fixed his wife with a stern gaze. You know the rules, don't try to leave the house, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying an unmistakable command. Mrs. Davenport nodded silently and made her way back to the couch in the living room. Noticing Elena still standing there, Mr. Davenport's attention snapped to her. It's not right to linger and watch, he said, his tone sharp. Go to the foyer and wait to welcome the guests in. Instead, embarrassed at being caught eavesdropping, Elena bowed deeply. I'm sorry, sir. Of course. She hurried away, her mind whirling with questions about what she had just witnessed. As Elena made her way to the grand foyer, her mind raced with thoughts about the interaction she had just witnessed. Mr. Davenport's words echoed in her head. You know the rules, don't leave the house. It seemed strange, almost controlling. She tried to rationalize it, wondering if perhaps Mrs. Davenport was ill or if there was some other reason for such a strict rule. Elena positioned herself by the door, standing straight and composed. She watched as Hannah and the other maids arranged a table with an assortment of canapes and welcome drinks. The anticipation in the air was palpable as they awaited the arrival of the important guests. Soon the sound of luxury cars pulling into the winding driveway broke the silence. 3 sleek vehicles came to a stop in front of the villa. Elena took a deep breath, reminding herself of the proper protocol for greeting guests. As the car doors opened, Elena stepped forward with a bright professional smile. Welcome to the Davenport Villa, she said warmly, gesturing for the guests to enter. Mr. and Mrs. Davenport appeared in the foyer, their early attention masked by polished smiles. They greeted their guests with enthusiasm, exchanging pleasantries and compliments. Richard, my old friend, one of the guests exclaimed, clapping Mr. Davenport on the back. This place is even more magnificent than I remembered. You're too kind, Charles. Mr. Davenport replied smoothly. Sophia and I are delighted to have you all here. As the group moved towards the lounge, Elena couldn't help but notice Mrs. Davenport's stiff posture. She seemed uncomfortable, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Occasionally, Mr. Davenport would lean in to whisper something in her ear, causing her to nod slightly. Once the guests were settled at the dining table in the lounge, Elena, Jonathan and Hannah began serving the dishes. As Elena placed a plate in front of Mrs. Davenport, the woman raised her hand slightly. Excuse me, Mrs. Davenport said softly, could you bring coffee for the Table and make mine a double shot, please. Elena nodded, noting the request. Seemed odd given the fresh cold drinks already on the table. Nevertheless, she hurried to the kitchen to relay the order to Marco, returning with a tray of hot coffee cups. Elena served Mrs. Davenport last, making sure her cup contained the requested double shot. As she placed the darker liquid before her, she caught a flicker of gratitude in Mrs. Davenport's eyes. With the brunch underway, Elena and Hannah took their positions outside the lounge door. The sound of laughter and relaxed conversation drifted out, along with praises for the food. Elena leaned closer to Hannah, whispering, "Did you know how Mrs. Davenport isn't allowed to leave the house? It's strange, isn't it?" Hannah nodded. "It's always been that way. I think it's just their marriage arrangement. You know, rich people have their own uniqueness, unlike us." Elena, relieved she wasn't the only one who found it odd, lowered her voice. "Does anyone know why?" Shrugged. "Not really. It's been that way since she arrived. Mr. Davenport is very protective of her when she does go out. There's always a group of bodyguards surrounding her in tight circle, but even the First Lady doesn't stay indoors all the time." Elena, amused. "True," Hannah conceded, "but she's still lucky in many ways. Mr. Davenport gives her everything she could want: designer clothes, jewelry, trips to their other properties. She wants for nothing." Hannah's words, "want for nothing," echoed in Elena's mind. She wasn't sure if she would truly want for nothing in Mrs. Davenport's position, perhaps because she was used to the freedom of going wherever she pleased. As they continued their hushed conversation, a commotion from the lounge caught their attention. The scrape of chairs and raised voices filled the air. "Hannah, what's going on in there? Should we check?" Elena asked. "I don't know, but no, we shouldn't barge in unless called," Hannah replied. Sighed before either of them could think what to do. A voice rang out, "Ma, we need assistance." Elena exchanged a worried glance with Hannah before quickly opening the door and stepping inside. The scene before her was one of confusion. Mrs. Davenport was standing, her face pale and drawn. "I'm not feeling well," Mrs. Davenport said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could you please escort me to my room?" Mr. Davenport's jaw clenched, but he maintained his composure in front of the guests. "Of course, darling, get some rest. We'll speak later." His eyes, however, told a different story as they followed his wife's retreating form. Elena guided Mrs. Davenport out of the lounge, acutely aware of the tension lingering behind them. As she closed the door and followed, she couldn't shake the memory of Mr. Davenport's angry glare. She wondered if the other guests had noticed it too, but as she trailed behind Mrs. Davenport to the stairs, a nagging feeling crept in. Something was off about the lady of the house. As Elena and Mrs. Davenport ascended the grand staircase, the tension from the dining room seemed to follow them like a heavy cloud. Mrs. Davenport's steps were unsteady, and Elena found herself instinctively reaching out to support her elbow. "You don't need to follow me upstairs," Mrs. Davenport said softly, her voice neutral but tinged with something Elena couldn't quite place. "I can manage on my own." Elena hesitated, torn between her professional duty and her growing concern for the woman beside her. "It's my job to look after everyone in the household, ma'am," she replied gently, "including you. I want to make sure you're all right." As they reached the top of the stairs, Mrs. Davenport paused, her hand gripping the banister tightly. For a moment, Elena thought she saw a flicker of vulnerability in the woman's eyes, but it was quickly masked. They continued down the hallway to the master bedroom. Mrs. Davenport's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the doorknob. "Thank you, Elena. You can leave now. I just need to rest." Elena bowed respectfully but didn't move. "If you'd like, I can wait outside your door in case you need anything. The other staff are busy downstairs, and no one would hear you if you called for assistance." Mrs. Davenport shook her head. "No, that won't be necessary. I just want some time alone." But as she spoke, Elena noticed tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. The sight of those unshed tears stirred something in Elena. She knew it wasn't her place, knew she was overstepping boundaries, but she couldn't bear to leave Mrs. Davenport alone in this state. Elena said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "Are you truly okay?" The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with implication, then like a dam breaking. Mrs. Davenport's composure crumbled. She shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Without thinking, Elena stepped forward and closed the bedroom door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. Mrs. Davenport sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Elena sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to intrude. "I'm here if you need to talk," she said gently, "and I promise I can be discreet." Mrs. Davenport looked up, her eyes red and puffy. Could I hug you?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. "I just need a shoulder." Surprised but moved, Elena Nodded. Mrs. Davenport leaned into her, wrapping her arms around Elena's waist and burying her face in her shoulder. Her sobs grew louder, years of pent-up emotion pouring out as she held the crying woman. Elena's mind raced. What could have happened between Mrs. Davenport and her husband to cause such distress? Was this related to their morning argument, or was there something else, something deeper? After several minutes, Mrs. Davenport's sobs quieted. She pulled away, sniffled, and wiped her eyes. Oh dear, she murmured, attempting a watery smile. I'm so sorry I've ruined my dress. And your uniform, she added, glancing at Elena. No, don't worry about my uniform, ma'am, it's okay, Elena said gently. Then she glanced down at the tear-stained fabric of the lady's dress, noticing smudges of her foundation. Would you like me to get you a fresh one, ma'am? Mrs. Davenport nodded. Yes, please, the white one with the neckband similar to this. It's in the walk-in wardrobe. Elena stood and made her way to the expansive wardrobe. As she surved through the rows of designer dresses, she couldn't help but notice a pattern. Every single dress featured some form of high neckline or collar. It seemed an odd fashion choice for someone living in such a warm climate. Finding the requested dress, Elena returned to Mrs. Davenport. As she handed over the garment, their eyes met, and Elena saw a flicker of something, fear, gratitude, pass across Mrs. Davenport's face. Thank you, Mrs. Davenport said, taking the dress. Would you mind waiting here for a moment? I'd like you to take this dress to be cleaned right away. The tear stains and makeup marks need to be treated before they set. Elena nodded, watching as Mrs. Davenport disappeared into the ensuite bathroom. As she waited, her eyes scanned the room, taking in the opulent furnishings that suddenly seemed cold and impersonal. When Mrs. Davenport emerged, freshly changed, she handed the stained dress to Elena. Their fingers brushed, and Mrs. Davenport grasped Elena's hand. For a moment. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for being here, for letting me cry. I'm sorry you had to see me like that. Elena squeezed her hand gently. There's no need to apologize, everyone has moments of weakness. I understand. As Mrs. Davenport pulled her into another hug, Elena felt a surge of protectiveness wash over her, but as they embraced, the neckband of Mrs. Davenport's dress shifted slightly, revealing something that made Elena's blood run cold. There on the pale skin of Mrs. Davenport's neck was a tattoo, but not just any tattoo. It was a barcode. Elena's mind reeled as she stared at the barcode tattoo on Mrs. Davenport's neck. She pulled away from the hug abruptly, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. Is something wrong? Mrs. Davenport asked, her voice tinged with concern. Elena struggled to find her voice, her professional demeanor momentarily shattered. I know everything's all right, ma'am, she managed to say, trying to regain her composure, but the image of the barcode burned in her mind and she couldn't let it go. May I ask you something personal? Mrs. Davenport tensed visibly but nodded slowly. That tattoo on your neck, Elena began hesitantly. What is it, and why are you hiding it? I noticed all your dresses cover your neck. The color drained from Mrs. Davenport's face. She took a step back, pulling away from Elena, her hand instinctively reaching for her neck. I think you need to leave now, Elena, she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she cleared her throat. Forget what you saw, it's safer for everyone that way. But Elena couldn't let it go. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Mrs. Davenport's constant confinement to the house, her fearful demeanor, the controlling behavior of Mr. Davenport. Safer. I'm sorry, but ma'am, if you're in danger, you need to tell me. I've noticed how scared and unhappy you've been today. I want to help. Mrs. Davenport's eyes darted nervously to the door, as if expecting Mr. Davenport to burst in at any moment. There's no but. You don't know anything about my husband, she said, her voice trembling, and you don't want to find out who he truly is. It's better to keep it that way. Elena felt a chill run down her spine at these words. What do you mean? Who is he really? Mrs. Davenport shook her head vehemently. Please, she said, glancing at the name tag on Elena's uniform. Elena, promise me you won't tell anyone about the tattoo. If anyone finds out, not only will I be in danger, but you and everyone else who knows will be in very big trouble. Elena's mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. I promise, she said solemnly, but please let me help you if you need anything. You don't have to face this alone. Before Mrs. Davenport could respond, the bedroom door swung open. Mr. Davenport stood in the doorway, his expression dark. The guests left early, he said, his voice cold. He turned to Elena. You can leave now, go work in the garden or something. Elena hesitated, looking at Mrs. Davenport. The fear in the woman's eyes was palpable now. Mr. Davenport repeated his tone, leaving no room for argument. Elena had no choice but to leave. As she walked out, she exchanged One last meaningful glance with Mrs. Davenport silently promising that this wasn't over. As Elena made her way down the hallway, she paused, her instincts telling her to stay close in case Mrs. Davenport needed help. She lingered near the door, straining to hear any sign of distress. Suddenly Mr. Davenport's face appeared in the doorway. "I told you to go," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Don't linger here, we don't need anything else. The guests have left and the lounge needs to be cleaned up." "Go." Elena nodded, her heart pounding as she made her way downstairs. She glanced over her shoulder one last time before descending the stairs, only to see Mr. Davenport still watching her from the doorway. The intensity of his gaze made her skin crawl as she reached the ground floor. Elena's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. She made her way to the kitchen where the other staff members were busy cleaning up. Hannah approached her, concern etched on her face. "Elena, what's going on? You look pale," Hannah said, touching her sister's arm. Elena hesitated, remembering her promise to Mrs. Davenport. "Hannah," she said quietly, "have you ever noticed anything off about Mr. Davenport?" Hannah furrowed her brow. "Off? No, not really. Hugh's always been very kind and polite, especially compared to some of the other wealthy people I've worked for." Marco, the chef, overheard their conversation as he passed by Mr. Davenport. "He's a saint if you ask me. Very patient man, especially considering his wife's delicate nature." Elena felt a surge of anger at Marco's words. "Delicate? What do you mean?" Marco shrugged. "Well, I've been their private chef for 7 years now. I've seen Mrs. Davenport cry over the smallest things more times than I can count. She's lucky to be his wife. If you ask me, if she worked in the kitchen or anywhere else with that attitude, she'd be useless." Elena bit her tongue, fighting the urge to defend Mrs. Davenport. She remembered her promise and knew she couldn't reveal what she had learned. "Why are you asking about Mr. Davenport?" Marco inquired, eyeing Elena so suspiciously. Elena shook her head, trying to appear nonchalant. "No reason, just curious. He's been my inspiration for such a long time." Marco nodded, seemingly satisfied, but then he added, "Must be because of the incident earlier. First time you've seen Mrs. Davenport cry, right? Well, trust me, it happens all the time. She's just a sensitive soul. Don't worry about it. I've worked here for years and never once saw Mr. Davenport mistreat or manhandle her." Hannah nodded in agreement, but Elena remained unconvinced. She opened her mouth to say more, but Jonathan, the head butler, appeared in the doorway. "That's enough gossiping," he said sternly. "Back to work, all of you. We need to have this place spotless before Mr. Davenport comes down." As Elena turned back to her tasks, her mind was racing. She knew now that something sinister was happening in the Davenport household, something that went far beyond a simple marital dispute. The barcode tattoo, Mrs. Davenport's fear, Mr. Davenport's controlling behavior, it all pointed to a dark secret that she was now unwittingly a part of. She glanced at the clock, wondering how she could help Mrs. Davenport without putting either of them in danger. As she scrubbed the kitchen counters, Elena made a silent vow to herself she would find a way to help Mrs. Davenport no matter the cost. The day progressed in an eerie calm, as if the earlier events had been nothing more than a fleeting nightmare. Elena went about her duties mechanically, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Mrs. Davenport and the mysterious barcode tattoo. As the afternoon wore on, Elena found herself in the living room, dusting the ornate shelves filled with leather-bound books and expensive trinkets. The sound of footsteps caught her attention, and she turned to see Mr. Davenport entering the living room. His wife was noticeably absent, his face a mask of controlled tension. "Everyone," he called out, his voice carrying through the spacious villa, "gather here." Immediately Elena sat down her duster and straightened her uniform as the other staff members began to file into the room. Hannah appeared at her side, shooting her a questioning glance. "Marco." The chef wiped his hands on his apron as he entered, followed by Jonathan, the butler, his usual stoic expression tinged with curiosity as the staff assembled, forming a semicircle around Mr. Davenport. An uneasy silence fell over the room. Mr. Davenport's eyes scanned the gathered staff, his gaze sharp and scrutinizing. "I have an important announcement," he began, his voice low and controlled. "Mrs. Davenport is currently unwell and resting in our bedroom. Under no circumstances is anyone to enter her room or disturb her. Is that clear?" A chorus of yes, sir, echoed through the room. Elena felt her heart race. Knowing the truth behind Mrs. Davenport's illness, she struggled to keep her face neutral, acutely aware of Mr. Davenport's piercing gaze as it swept over each staff member. Mr. Davenport continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Anyone found disobeying will face immediate dismissal. No exceptions." The staff exchanged nervous glances, the severity of Mr. Davenport's words hanging heavily in the air. I will be leaving just shortly on urgent business, Mr. Davenport added, adjusting his expensive watch. I expect everything to be in perfect order upon my return. Jonathan, as the head of the butler, you're in charge in my absence. Jonathan nodded solemnly. Of course, sir, you can count on us. With one final sweeping look at his assembled staff, Mr. Davenport turned on his heel and strode out of the house. The sound of his footsteps faded, followed by the distant roar of his Ferrari's engine outside. Elena watched as he drove away. As the staff began to disperse, returning to their duties, Elena remained rooted to the spot. Her mind raced with the implications of Mr. Davenport's orders and the secret she now carried. Hannah approached her, concern etched on her face. Elena, are you all right? You look pale. Elena forced a smile, trying to appear normal. I'm fine, just a bit tired. Tired? It's been a long day. Hannah didn't seem entirely convinced but nodded. Well, we'd better get back to work. You know how Mr. Davenport is about everything being perfect. As Hannah walked away, Elena's gaze drifted towards the staircase leading to the upper floor. She thought of Mrs. Davenport alone and possibly hurt, trapped in a room she wasn't allowed to leave. The weight of her promise to keep the secret with her desire to help. Elena returned to her dusting, her movements now slow and distracted. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece ticked away, each second feeling like an eternity. She knew she had to do something, but what? How could she help Mrs. Davenport without risking both their safety? As she moved through the living room, carefully cleaning each surface, Elena's mind worked furiously, trying to formulate a plan. Elena made a decision. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. With careful movements, she finished her cleaning duties and made her way to Jonathan. Jonathan, she said, keeping her voice steady, I was thinking of cleaning the empty guest rooms upstairs. Open the windows to air them out. Replace the flowers. Would that be all right? Jonathan considered her request for a moment before nodding approvingly. Good thinking, Elena. Here, take this bucket of fresh flowers with you. They are delivered this morning by our daily florist. He handed her a beautifully arranged assortment of blooms. With the bucket in hand, Eleanor ascended the grand staircase, her heart pounding with each step. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps, but to her they seemed thunderously loud. As she reached the top, she paused, listening intently for any sound of movement. Elena's eyes were drawn to the closed door of the master bedroom. Once she reached the upper hallway where she knew Mrs. Davenport was confined, taking a deep breath to steady herself, Eleanor approached the door. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, remembering Mr. Davenport's stern warning. The consequences of disobedience hung heavily in the air, but the memory of Mrs. Davenport's fearful eyes and the mysterious barcode tattoo steeled Elena's resolve. She knocked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Davenport, it's me, Elena. Please, can you open the door? For what seemed like an eternity, there was only silence. Elena's pulse raced every second, stretching out painfully. Just as she was about to give up, she heard a faint click. The door opened a crack, revealing Mrs. Davenport's pale, tear-stained face. Elena. Mrs. Davenport's voice was hoarse, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway. You shouldn't be here. If anyone finds out, I know. Elena replied, her voice low and urgent, but I could stop thinking about you. Are you all right? Mrs. Davenport paused for a moment before opening the door wider, letting Elena slip inside. She clutched the bucket of flowers, afraid that leaving it outside in the hallway would draw attention and lead someone to search for her. Once the door clicked shut behind them, Elena set the bucket down beside the door, but as she took in the scene of Mrs. Davenport's room, she gasped at the sight before her. The usually immaculate room was in disarray. Shattered glass littered the floor near the vanity, and Elena could see visible bruises on Mrs. Davenport's arms and legs. The woman's designer dress was torn and stained with tears. Oh my God, Elena breathed, setting down the flower bucket by the door. What happened? Did Mr. Davenport do this to you? Mrs. Davenport nodded weakly, tears welling up in her eyes. She took a step forward, but her legs gave out. Elena rushed to catch her, helping her to the edge of the luxurious king-sized bed. Please, Elena pleaded, her heart racing. You have to tell me what's going on. What's the tattoo about? I want to help you, to get you out of this horror. Mrs. Davenport looked at Elena, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. I'm not willingly with him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He bought me. I belong to him. Now Elena felt as if the ground had dropped out from under her. The opulent room seemed to spin around her as she struggled to comprehend Mrs. Davenport's words. Bought? What do you mean? Did he take your money? Mrs. Davenport shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. No, he bought me from. But before she could finish her sentence, the distant roar of a Ferrari engine cut through the air. Mr. Davenport had returned unexpectedly early. Panic flashed across Mrs. Davenport's face. You have to go now, she hissed, her voice filled with terror. Elena stood her mind racing. I'll call for help, she said, moving towards the door. No, Mrs. Davenport pleaded, grabbing Elena's arm with surprising strength. You can't do that, please, it's not safe. But Elena's decision was made. With a final reassuring glance at Mrs. Davenport, she slipped out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. As the police escorted Mr. Davenport away in handcuffs, Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The room was still, save for the muffled sounds of distant sirens and the hushed whispers of the staff. Hannah stood beside her, her hand trembling as she gripped Elena's arm. I can't believe it. Is this really happening? She whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Elena nodded, her heart still racing from the chaotic events of the day. It's over for him, Hannah. But for Sophia, it's just the beginning. Sophia stood in the corner of the room, her arms crossed, her eyes distant yet full of resolve. She had finally found the courage to stand up for herself, and the relief in her eyes was palpable, though it was clear the journey ahead would be difficult. As the officers continued to process the scene, one of them approached Elena and Hannah. We need to take statements from all of you, the officer said, his voice calm but authoritative. Please come with us. The three women walked toward the front door, where a black SUV was waiting to take them to the police station. The staff watched them leave, their faces filled with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. They had been caught in a web of lies and deceit, just as Elena had been, but now they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered reality. Sophia climbed into the SUV first, her gaze unwavering. She had already been through so much, and now, with the world seemingly falling apart around her, she held her head high. She was a survivor, and Elena, standing beside her, felt proud to be there for her. As the door closed behind them, Elena took one last look at the villa that had once seemed so grand and glamorous. The Davenport estate, with all its wealth and opulence, was now a hollow shell. What had once been a symbol of success was now a monument to the darkness that had been hidden within its walls. The drive to the station was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional murmur between the three women. Elena felt the weight of their journey ahead. The legal battles, the uncertainty, and the questions about what would happen next were all looming over them. But she knew one thing: they would face it together. When they arrived at the station, the officers escorted them into a private room. The air was tense, but there was also a sense of purpose. The time for secrets and lies was over. Sophia was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the emotional toll the day had taken. I never imagined my life would end up like this, she said quietly. I was living a lie for so long, pretending that everything was perfect. But I wasn't living at all. Elena squeezed her hand, offering silent support. You're not alone, Sophia. You're free now. We'll help you rebuild. The officers took their statements, carefully documenting every detail. The reality of what had been happening in the Davenport household, the trafficking, the abuse, the control, was finally coming to light. There was no turning back now. As the night wore on, the exhaustion from the day's events began to settle in. Elena's mind kept replaying the shocking moments, from the discovery of the tattoo to the arrest. It felt like everything had happened so fast, but at the same time it had been years in the making. Sophia was given a temporary place to stay in a safe house, and Elena knew she would need time to process everything. But there was still work to be done. The fight for justice had only just begun. Thank you, Sophia said softly as she looked at Elena and Hannah. I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done. You saved my life. Elena smiled warmly, her heart swelling with emotion. You don't need to repay us. We just did what was right. The three women shared a moment of quiet understanding, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, but that they would face it together. As they walked out of the station and into the cold night air, Elena glanced at the two women beside her. They had come so far in such a short time. What had started as a job had become a mission. And now, with Mr. Davenport behind bars, they could finally begin to heal. But healing would take time. The scars of the past couldn't be erased overnight. But Elena knew that with the support of the women who had become her sisters in this fight, anything was possible. In the distance, the flashing lights of police vehicles illuminated the night, a symbol of justice finally being served. And though the future was uncertain, Elena couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Together they would rebuild their lives. Together they would find strength in the face of darkness.